Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the SICS seminar series, and we are here for the November session with Travis. But before I start, I'd like to begin with acknowledgement of country. So we would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra, and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charleston's campuses are located, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present. And just because some of you come in straight into the Zoom meeting, some of you, for some reason, has had to wait in the waiting room. So I'll keep on admitting people as well if they're stuck in the waiting room. So today I will be again helping navigating, and I think Tina is coming as well here. I'm just admitting her. So today I will be helping navigating the session. As always, I take turns with Jane, but today's my turn. So we have Travis Holland. Travis, I don't think we need introduction for Travis, but anyway, I will read a little bit of blurb about Travis. So for those of you who don't yet know who Travis is, he's a senior lecturer in communication at CSU, and he teaches both undergrad and master subjects on digital media, communication theory, and research strategies. And his research focus is on the relationship between science and media. He's working on projects exploring the role of podcasting in paleontology, informal education through museums and outreach initiatives, and the role of televisual images in human spaceflight. So very rich combo there. And today, Travis will be talking to us about a paleo podcasting, a practice-led extended mixed methods case study. The abstract is attached in the invitation as well as in the what's new announcement. So I don't think I need to go through that, because otherwise there will be a double up of what Travis is going to be sharing with you today. Now, without further ado, this is 5 minutes past 12. I'm going to hand over the microphone to you, Travis. If you have any questions or anything along the way, feel free to put in the chat. Otherwise, at the end, probably, just unmute ourselves, because this is quite an intimate group. I guess there are only 11 of us here today. Over to you, Travis.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anita. Thanks everyone for coming. So I've been for quite a while, I've been working on sort of transitioning what has been a traditional media and communication research practice more towards something focused on science communication. And that has been for a couple of reasons, probably the main one of which has been to sort of help give a bit more purpose and structure to what I've been doing, but also because these are areas that I've been interested in for my whole life. And so I undertook some study in space studies a few years ago with the support of the school at the time. And I'm also now doing another piece of undergraduate study in paleontology, funnily enough. And so, as if I don't have enough qualifications, that's leading me to this point where I'm combining those things with my media research. And so this paleo podcasting research then is a combination of my sort of 20 years of radio and podcast experience with some of those interests and studies. And what I've been doing, as you'll see here, is sort of tying that in with broader trends in science communication. Now, what's interesting about science communication to me is that it has its own language, and it's really quite separate from communication and media studies. Science communicators are very often scientists first, and they happen to do communication, and they're very interested in figuring out how to get their findings out into the public in a more effective way. So this is a kind of straightforward definition of science communication, widely cited. I think it's from the Journal of Science Communication. But being scientists first rather than communicators they very often don't engage with the same kinds of debates that we find in media and communication. And this has been an interesting trend for me. It's really, really a divergent field. And also, what I've started to note is that sometimes they actually explicitly say it's not even an offshoot or related to communications, that it's its own discipline. And so this is the trend we get here. They talk about models centered around public understanding of science, scientific culture, and science literacy quite often. The practical work in the space is often linked to academic work as well. And as I said, it tends to be taken up by those who are science communicators first, scientists first and communicators second. I think I'm disinclined to say this in most spaces, but the field is even somewhat hostile to non-science-based communicators. So as someone coming from outside the field, there's a lot of work to try and establish my sort of reputation. And the way I've done that is by spending a lot of time asking questions and interviewing people in the field, and particularly some of the emerging scientists in paleontology who've done some really interesting work. So just to contextualize that a little bit more, in addition to paleo, which I'm going to talk about now, and paleontology, I've also been working on space studies, as I mentioned, as Anita mentioned. So I published an article earlier this year looking at television or the role of television in the human space program, the US human space program, since the Apollo era through to now. And that was a long time project that I had a lot of eyes on over the years. That is leading into some further work looking at the upcoming Artemis missions and the moon landing there. I've also been working on some projects with the Australian Space Discovery Centre, or the Australian Space Agency as well, and CSIRO. Again, it's been interesting to try and get into the space agency is quite new, and they're very interested in engaging with people as much as possible, and they have a kind of entrepreneurial startup mindset. So they've been quite open, but a more established agency like CSIRO is much more guarded. And I think they perceive possible criticism more likely than they perceive opportunities to work with people. So that all brings me to my work on this science communication podcast called Fossils and Fiction, where I've interviewed paleontologists, authors, thinkers, communicators, museum staff over the last 2 years. And then I've also used the interviews from the podcast to focus on or to help write an article. So in addition to pitching the podcast itself as a piece of creative work, which I've had some internal trouble with, which I can talk more about if people are interested, but I'm actually giving another talk to the Creative Practice Circle next week to talk more in detail about podcasting as a method of creative research. In addition to pitching it as a piece of creative research, that is the podcast itself, I am also trying to undertake some formal study based on those interviews, or traditional published papers based on those interviews. So paleontology sits at the intersection of geoscience and biology. It focuses on the exploration of past life. What's interesting, one of the things that's interesting to me is that this is a field of science that's always been very tightly integrated with creative methods, because it's not a field of science where you can take photos of the features, right? You've got fossils, sure, and they can be displayed in museums, but to really bring them to life, you need to engage artists, because it's just not possible to bring dinosaurs and Pleistocene animals and various other extinct organisms to life without artwork. And so right from the founding of the field, we've seen very strong influence of paleo art, as it's broadly called. And then recently there's been projects looking at paleo poems and video games and comics. And of course, we have those really influential films and documentaries and others, which have kind of brought the brought the field to the fore in a public sense, and things like Jurassic Park have really strongly influenced how people see dinosaurs. And even as the views have changed in the 30 years since Jurassic Park was released, things have the public image of dinosaurs has sort of continued to persist in that 1993 framework, really, because of the success of that film at that time. So I've pitched this project as a 2-year multi-method study that consists of the podcast production, a survey of the field, and then analysis of interviews. And I framed that up within a framework developed by Janet Fulton from the University of Newcastle and her colleagues, which was only published this year, called Extended Mixed Methods, in which they describe obviously qualitative and quantitative methods as mixed methods, and then you add creative practice to that and reflective creative practice to bring up extended mixed methods. So the outcomes are the multi-season podcast, that's sort of academic work, and then a paper targeted for science communication, which is just about ready. I've sent it to the people who are mentioned because they're mentioned by name, and they're given their sort of full name and title and everything else. So I just want them to have an opportunity to review that work. That's part of doing this kind of creative work, which is fairly distinct and fairly different from what you might typically experience in an academic research project, and that is that I'm essentially waiving anonymity for the participants, and they're quite well aware of that, because conforming to this podcast style of production, anonymity isn't something that you would typically do in a podcast, right? So for a media practice project, which sort of adopts journalistic norms, it essentially waives anonymity, and that was put through the ethics process and all approved, and it's been discussed quite widely with the participants. But also, as I said, they have had an opportunity, or they're having the opportunity, to review the paper, review the actual quotes and the way I've presented them as well. So as part of that, I go into that in more detail in the later talk. I tried not to make them overlap too much. But I'm happy to share details of that with anyone as well. So fossils and fiction, 24 episodes and counting. I've just locked in interviews for 25 and 26. There's over 12 hours of audio and video content. So the average time is about half an hour, a little over half an hour. It's had about 2,000 downloads in the year, which isn't a lot, but I'm happy with that. There's not many academic projects out there that actually get that much download quite often. We don't tend to see that. So I think that's quite good. I've tagged the intro and outro of the podcast as being supported by Charles Sturt University, effectively just supported through my time. It's the production is entirely self-funded. It's consisted of interviews with the following people so far: 9 paleontologists, the next 2 interviews with paleontologists, that brings up to 11. 3 museum workers who are not paleontologists. Obviously, many paleontologists hold museum and academic appointments as well. 5 other non-paleontology academics who otherwise have interesting experience on that. So there's been people like film scholars who I've spoken to, for example, to talk about other paleontology films or paleo media. 3 other sci-commers, so 3 other people whose main sort of role is science communication, and then 5 other creatives. So sometimes they've been artists and sometimes sort of general content creators. I've also have a student intern, so I'm looking forward to working with the student intern. It's a really nice way to blend teaching and research, I think, to bring the student onto the project, offering them lots of opportunity to help me edit and get things up and produce social media content, the sort of things that they need to do to generate or to demonstrate professional competency as well. So I'm trying as much as possible to blend this with teaching. And in addition to that, it's part of being a media production academic is, trying to keep your skills sharp, which is why I've undertaken this as a podcast project. And then I'm obviously teaching podcasts. The survey of the field identified 24 other paleo podcasts, and that was at the end of last year. I've since found dozen more. It seems to be a burgeoning field, but I stuck with those 24. The logos, I did a sort of analysis of the logos and found that 11 of them had fossils, 8 of them had dinosaurs, and 4 of them had humans in the logos. So this is just to give a sense of what the field's sort of like. The titles, 4 of them mentioned the words paleo, 3 dinosaur, 3 Jurassic. And the Jurassic ones were pretty much all related to Jurassic Park. 6 of them used the word cast or podcast. The hosts of those, 10 of them were scientists, 2 journalists, and 5 others. And the topics of the podcast broadly, obviously, I tried to keep it within definition of what I described as paleo podcast, but 9 of them broadly talked about paleontology, 7 about evolution, 4 were sort of focused on dinosaur media, so that's mostly the Jurassic Park ones, and then 3 were just focused squarely on dinosaurs as opposed to other parts of paleontology. So this is their kind of social media analysis. So this is the 24 podcasts, and you can see the very top ones are actually part of bigger enterprises, which I find quite interesting. So Origin Stories is part of the Leakey Foundation, which is a kind of funder and advocacy organization in the US, and in general is part of a bigger Jurassic Park fan media enterprise. Tetrapod Zoology is part of Darren Naish, who's a paleontologist, part of his work. But the podcast doesn't have its own separate social media enterprises. And so the Jurassic Park podcast is the first pure podcast in the list in terms of followers. Of this list, the people I've interviewed come from the Jurassic Park podcast, and I Know Dino, and a few others as well. So this is just a count of the category, as I kind of have already gone through the numbers. So the outcomes and next steps of the projects, I've got to undertake when I did the slides, I was having to undertake a bit more of the podcast interviews, but I have actually finished that in the last week. And as I said, finished the paper and sent it to them. I've described the ways in which the podcasters who I've interviewed have a deep understanding of their audience via social media and surveys, the ways in which they rely on producing entertaining and accurate content. A lot of them focus on accuracy, even when they're actually talking about fictional realms. So one of them was a sort of creator attached to the Jurassic Park podcast who has done an entirely fictional story set in that kind of Jurassic universe, but he still was wanting to focus as much on scientific accuracy as possible, except where the animals were animals from Jurassic Park and were therefore inaccurate. So what was also interesting is that a lot of these podcasters were conscious of what might be called the dinosaur bias in paleontology. So obviously paleontology covers any extinct animal, and half of the history of life on Earth doesn't have dinosaurs, but they know that dinosaurs also tend to attract an audience, and so they were conscious of trying to balance that. And so that's it. That's the kind of talk. I'm happy to take questions. I know I really zoomed through that, but it's been a really interesting project. I think that's combined the three methods. The interviews with the paleo podcasters hopefully have provided some interesting insights, which I can get published. And I will note as well, I actually submitted the paper initially in January this year to Media International Australia without the analysis of the interviews. So it just had a sort of practice reflection and then the analysis of the other podcasts. But it was rejected for sort of not focusing enough on the podcast medium amongst a few other criticisms. And so that's partly motivated the reformulation that I've gone through over the past 12 months. And I'm going to send it off to a science communication specific journal, because I think they're less likely to get hung up on the medium issues around what podcasting is and that kind of stuff. Because some of my views on what podcasting is kind of goes against the orthodoxy, as Michelle O'Connor well knows. So yeah, that's what I have. So I'll stop sharing and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Travis. Interesting indeed. Is there any comment, question from anyone? So SciComm, is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, yes. SciComm is sort of the broad field, I guess.
Anyone? Any comment, question?
I flew through that much quicker than I expected to, actually. I thought I was going to run out of time, so.
Breaking the record, 20 minutes, actually,
Yeah.
that was Travis.
David?
Yeah, Travis, that was really interesting. I was wondering if there are historical comparisons to what would have occurred in, I don't know, the 1940s, the 1990s, the 2016s, to look at the way in which has anyone consistently done interviews in that sort of science communication area? And is there a deeper background of some, probably even a historical researcher who's looked at this sort of thing and even interviewed older people in the area? Have you seen any of that? Is that something that's common, or does it require a new journal?
There's plenty of journals of science communication out there. There's at least 4 or 5 with those terms in that name. The field has really only been established as a sort of thing since the 80s, maybe the 90s. Yeah. And that was basically when a lot of scientists realized that nobody was paying attention to their work. So, I mean, when I say scientists, these are all pretty much STEM people. They're not social scientists or what we might broadly call academics. They're pretty much all STEM in that kind of space, the hard sciences, the physical sciences. They sort of realized that nobody was paying attention much to their work, or that they needed to control the narratives a little bit more. And so that's where the field was really established. And as I said, it's quite funny. There's a podcast I listened to by David Hone, who's a paleontologist in the UK. He's quite well known. He does a lot of SciComm and outreach work. And he was complaining on one of his episodes recently. He spent basically the whole episode complaining about people coming to paleontology from outside. Like you get physicists and engineers and biomechanics people who'd come in and do analysis of extinct animals and the way they might or have moved, or mathematicians is the other one that he wanted to, without taking into account existing research in the field. And in the same sort of episode, he then switched to, I did an analysis of all these media articles about how they describe paleontology and everything else once. And I did reply to their on social media on Threads and said, as a media scholar, we get that a lot, that people do, because he was complaining about people coming into paleontology from the outside. And I'm like, do you realize that media studies is a thing, and you've done exactly that as well? It was quite sort of funny. So,
well, the only reason why some of this I brought up, and I'll allow Paul's question to come up in a second, is that in a way I've studied public intellectuals in different things, how academics move into that realm. And it's not an exact match by no stretch. But if I think of Carl Sagan as an astrophysicist, totally visible. And so I was wondering if there is something about science communication and relative visibility that is also explored to a degree, that it's not the mixed method, but when you ask the questions, you talk about, is this designed to get facts, information, things moving faster and further in the same way, I suppose, that journalism operates, but other things operate, but also how it can move to new investigations, even if it's not the science communication, but it's actually the the scientists, if you want to call it that are involved in paleontology.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I was going to say with that too is that the word science is also interesting. Our entire fields in Europe are often called sciences. They're not necessarily called the same thing elsewhere. We don't think of it that way, but almost all of academic study is scientific in previous eras. This postdates the development of everything was philosophy in the 18th century and earlier, but the last 200 years, especially in Europe, science has been central to the organization of knowledge itself. Is that a play that you sometimes find between different cultures as well? I don't know. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so with the historical thing, I hadn't considered it very much, and I think I should actually. You've pointed out an area I need to go back to. That was something I looked at in the space paper because I started in the 60s with Project Mercury, and I went through NASA's evolving relationship to television specifically, but also more broadly to the press. And it was quite interesting because although NASA has a requirement to, as part of it being a public organization, it actually has a requirement to communicate with the public in its act, in its constitution, if you will. There was a lot of internal debate about what that meant, and astronauts in particular were not interested in engaging with the press. It was really only with the Apollo astronauts who were selected specifically and given training to engage with the press that sort of started to change. But even then, some of them, they refused to conduct the broadcasts live when they were told to, because they can't be forced to press the button on the TV camera once they're actually in the space capsule. So they just didn't do it sometimes. And NASA's public affairs.
It's always good to remember John Glenn too became a senator, but
yeah.
that's another.
But NASA's public affairs people, you could see them like in the documents, they could see the inherent goodness in communicating and doing the live broadcasts and whatnot, but the astronauts were focused on what they were actually doing up there as opposed to getting on television. So that whole culture was quite a challenge. And you compare that to now, where with the Artemis mission that went around the moon this year, there was like literally a live stream from the moment it kind of got outside of the atmosphere through its whole orbit of the moon, with the exception of when it couldn't actually broadcast from behind the moon, but and there was loss of signal. But there was a live stream that millions of people around the world were watching of this space capsule, and you can imagine the high definition live surface of the moon footage we're going to get when they land back there in 5 or 6 years. It's going to be extraordinary. So I want to return to that, but actually the question of public understanding of paleontology, or the efforts to understand paleontology, is an interesting one. So certainly I've linked it back to artists and others throughout history, but I don't know that that's focused on, sorry, I'm just rambling now, but good question.
We've got another question from Paul in the chat. Travis?
Elaborate on the comment about having perspectives on podcasts that differ to those in the orthodoxy. So I guess what I meant by that is that coming from outside science, my approach to this and conceptualizing this is less about just marketing the science than what I think science communicators quite often are, Paul. So I think my own approach is a bit different to the orthodoxy. The podcasters I interviewed are also more broadly reflect my approach than they might. Like, some of them wouldn't probably be considered science communicators by scientists, particularly the ones that talk about Jurassic Park or other sort of paleo media more so than direct science. So I tried to, that's one of the ways that I'm trying to bridge cultural studies with science a bit more, is by including thoughts of basically storytelling. How do we actually take this scientific knowledge and make it something that people connect to? And that tends to be, as much as anything, through storytelling approaches, including films. But that's kind of against the grain of what you might often see in these journals of people saying, oh, we need, it needs to be all about accuracy and the truth and very careful. Whereas I'm more kind of like, well, if you put a lot of these facts or ideas into the public realm, it gets people hooked on the ideas, and then they kind of go and look for more information themselves once they're interested. Yeah, so that's, I guess, one of the differences between what we think of communication as more socially grounded and cultural practice, rather than just imparting messages to people.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
Tina first. Head of school privileges.
Thanks, Sam. Travis, I think the very interesting presentation and the project you're doing. I'm particularly interested in these methods you are applying qualitative and creative practice. As you mentioned, the storytelling approach. In our previous project, when we work with the Aboriginal communities, we definitely incorporate their the oral heritage. Then when they talk, then we capture their interactions with the younger generations, but also with the lands they live on and they believe in. So this is kind of video ethnography approach. We also incorporate storytelling in our projects. And also in another project about the photo voice method we applied, which also has been widely used in public health and social work. So this using the people's photos, they capture their stories and context. So I'm very interested to know your insights about using this creative practice that will enrich, how this will enrich our traditional methods, we say the core and qual.
I think I was kind of doing this work and then trying to figure out how to conceptualize it when I came across Janet Fulton's article. So I'm happy to share the article, but if you just Google extended mixed methods and Fulton, it comes up. I think it was in Convergence. And I literally said to Janet when I saw the piece, I was like, this gives me the framework I've been looking for anyway. Like I'd already been there. I think the notion of taking bits and pieces from different methods and triangulating what we're doing is really helpful, but also it allows more of this cross-disciplinary perspective. And so one of the things that I have been doing, for example, is I've got another paper in train to present at a pre-convention for the International Communication Association next year. And it's a practice, one of the paleontologists I interviewed, who is a younger person, she's a couple of years younger than me. She's a paleontologist who's also doing a paleo podcast. And I'm working with her to write a practice-based account of paleo podcasting as well, that combines both the cultural studies side of things, so my perspective and hers, we write it together, basically. So I think the methods can actually offer a really valid and interesting cross-disciplinary perspective. And I've tried to institutionally, I've tried to carry those arguments both here and at other places as well. So, you know, we're still basically separated into STEM and we're still basically separated into STEM and HAS in Australia, at least. And I'd love to see that break down a lot more. Even here, there are science communication subjects taught by non-communicators. And my question is why? Like, I'd love to get into those classrooms and work with people. So I think if we can demonstrate actual value through the creative projects, that we actually have value and insight to offer, that we have practice-oriented learnings and methods and creative practices and insights that, for whatever reason, they don't have on the science side of things, then we can probably bridge that divide a bit more.
I think it will be very interesting to those STEM-based researchers. Yeah.
And I'd love to get published in the science communication journals, whereas at the moment, it's just that style thing. I still write very much in the communication media style. And then the scientists look at it and go, this doesn't make sense. They can't understand it half the time. Like, it's literally writing in a different language for them. So
absolutely, yeah.
Trying to figure out how to bridge that is, and one part is citing across discipline boundaries, or ignoring discipline boundaries when you cite as well. So even in the science, even in the space paper that I wrote, I made sure to cite the scientists as much as possible, where I was referring to their work instead of just analyzing it from a visual language perspective, which we might otherwise be tempted to do.
Yeah. Yeah, the one way you might team up with the people who from the science background, and then can write the course, the paper, that they can provide their insights on our writing practice to the science communication journal.
Yeah, there's. You're interested. Your mention of First Nations knowledge as well is important, because there's a debate I've been having. There's no literature, none whatsoever, that refers to First Nations perspectives on pre-human fossils in Australia. So there is some that refers to megafauna, because I guess First Nations people interacted with various megafauna. There's some that refers to, this such and such fossil was found on the land of whatever people, but there's nothing that considers First Nations perspectives on digging up and taking fossils out of country. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for the science here. And what makes that even weirder, perhaps, is that there is a really big movement within paleontology at the moment to look at colonialism, but they tend to see it as international colonialism. So like American scholars turning up in South America and taking fossils, or British scholars, or whatever they happen to be, and literally no one has thought about it. Scientists from the Queensland Museum going to outback Queensland and digging up whatever the hell they want and taking it back to Brisbane. Or just as an example, I don't have anything specific in mind, but those kinds of practices, which are within a First Nations framework, are exactly the same. So, yeah.
Thanks.
David, Cameron?
I think it's second now.
Sam was next. Sorry.
Thank you very
lost.
That's all right. I'm here. We all know where the queue is. Thank you, Travis, for a good presentation. And above all, thanks for the work you're doing in the podcast field. I mean, this is important and interesting. And I myself use podcasts frequently as a teaching resource, but I find I rarely cite them directly, even though I'm listening to them regularly. I'm also particularly looking forward to your presentation for the Creative Practice Research Circle coming up soon. And my question, I think, might be answered by that next presentation you're doing. But while we're here, let's ask. The question is about registering the podcast systems and the work you're doing as research points. Now, I'm all in favor of trying to do this in the way that works most efficiently and reflects well on your work. So my question is, do you see the individual podcast per episode as being the thing that you submit and the way you'd submit an individual article, or do you see the series as a whole as the creative practice work for research purposes? Where do you sit on that balance?
Actually, that might also relate to the word orthodoxy that I used before and Paul picked up on. My view on podcasting is that it is a medium that doesn't only consist of the audio and the recorded episodes. And so we can't only pay attention to those things, because there are significant industrial and distribution practices embedded in all of that. There's big challenges around the platforms that are seeking to control podcasts at the moment. Spotify, Apple, and Google through YouTube are some of the world's biggest tech companies, and they're all trying to get a piece of the pie. Meanwhile, scholars are out here still talking as if it's a wholly independent medium. That's really quite bizarre to me. So I tend to come at it from a medium studies perspective. And while I think the answer is possibly the direct answer to your specific question is possibly dependent on context, in this case, I think the whole podcast production, including the social media, the artwork, and the recorded episodes, is a single multi-year creative work for me.
I'm happy to hear that, because I probably agree with you on there as well. I was thinking about this in terms of temptation of thinking we have the quality of prolific versus quantity, and also the issue of, in a curated exhibition, you might have dozens of artworks included by various people. In the case of a podcast, dozens of interviewees on various topics, but the exhibition summarizes one thing in the creative practice research protocols as one artifact for the university's point of view. If you're looking at your work there as one artifact to be reviewed and assessed, I think has a very strong basis for being seen as active research. So thank you for that. Good.
What actually happened, very briefly, was that I submitted it through the Crow system. I had a peer review by David Marshall, who was here. I filled out all the paperwork and submitted it. And then at some point, a month or two later, it got marked as accepted. And I thought that had meant it had been accepted as a creative work. And then when RPI points came out this year, I found that it had been totally ignored, because the view of the RPI project team is that podcasts are not research. Even though within the Crow system, it says digital recorded works, including creative work. And that's where I lodged the podcast, and I had all the paperwork associated, and they said, no, this is not research. So that's an interesting debate we need to have internally, but I'm having it because it's a lot of work to not have a count.
That's right. I mean, I'm looking at my public lectures in different ways there, whereas the public lectures are created for classes. They had to be designed for the work itself, but they are outreach. They were made for a public audience in order to ensure the security of the work for enrolled students only. The audiences weren't being assessed, so they could see what they liked. They were basically sitting in the lectures, but they were not podcasted, mostly because of image permission rights with an online system, which podcasting to some extent can reduce or avoid. I know how you normally accompany a podcast with links or reference images to the custodians of those sources. So I'm interested in seeing how you're balancing that now with a view to other media that could benefit from the system you're using. So that's good. Thank you. David.
Yeah, thanks. Probably a question not so much about the research, Travis, but the product, the output. And I know you've just come back from the Community Broadcasting Association annual conference. Are you interested in taking the podcast to a wider radio audience through that network?
Yeah, so that's one of the tasks I have for my intern is to take the existing episodes and figure out which ones are any good for radio broadcast, because some of them are time specific, particularly where they're talking about, oh, such and such event, or this has just been published or whatever. So that has to be sort of edited before that happens. Especially we're now getting to 2 years old on the oldest ones. So yes, I want to do that. It's a question of time. I mean, editing just takes too long to put it in a format suitable for, because my episodes are all over the place. The shortest is 15 minutes. The shortest with an interview is 26 minutes, but the longest runs to 58 minutes. So, yeah, they need to be chopped up to a sort of 25-minute format to be suitable for radio.
Yeah, and then I guess there is a small science communication kind of group that do present programs through that community radio network. So they might be an interesting group to for your research as well, separate to podcasting.
I'd like to extend it into radio, and one of the ways I want to do that is by taking I had this conversation with some people at the conference. One of the ways that, not just this project, but I'd like to extend some science communication aspects and projects into radio. So I was looking at the National Science Week grants as a way to do that. But as always, the difficulty is that those are focused on delivering an outcome, whereas the university is focused on publications. And trying to get the two of those lined up, you know, sometimes they're competing interests, but they come from the same time and funding. So, yeah, that's something I'm going to try and sort out. So.
Thanks, Dana. And yeah, I can't agree more with you, David. That's a really great suggestion, Travis. Any other comment or question? We still have time. No?
Yeah,
No?
I'm happy to share those slides. Oh, those slides are actually available if anyone wants them. The URL is...
That'd be good if we can have it in the chat, Travis. And recording, as always, is going to be available on the school's
I think
YouTube
that's the
channel.
URL. Yeah.
Awesome.
If that's not the URL, I'll figure it out.
Thanks, Travis. And just a reminder to everyone, this is not the last seminar session for the year. We still have one more in December. Yes, Casey, I see your reaction. So one more in December on the Wednesday, the 13th of December. So it's not so close to the close down period. As always, 12 to 1. And that will be the last one for the year. Also a reminder, you know, calling for your expression of interest for 2024. We already have one presentation penciled in. So it'd be good. Hopefully, Jen and I are hoping to start in February next year. So do let us know, get in contact with either Jen or I if you'd like to present. And as always, again, it's not about just the success stories, but also sharing, you know, anything, any work that you're doing research-wise, of course, in one of the seminar sessions. Thanks, Travis. That's actually the last one is the URL. Is that?
Yeah, I think they're exactly the same, but obviously one has the HTTPS. But anyway.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
One worked and one didn't.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again for attending today's session, and thanks, Travis. That was, as I said, interesting indeed. And I'll see you again in a month's time. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Bye.